So I want you to picture a dinner party.
Okay.
It's a hypothetical one, obviously, because the guests are separated by time and geography. And frankly, they have completely incompatible personalities.
Right. It would probably be a disaster.
A complete disaster. But at the head of the table, you have a French mathematician from the 1930s. He's impeccably dressed, probably silent, and just radiating this intense mystical disapproval of basically everything modern.
Ah, the man who looked at the Eiffel Tower and saw spiritual devolution.
Exactly.
Guénon.
Guénon. Then, to his right, you have a firebrand revolutionary from 1964, Harlem. He's incredibly charismatic, he's terrifying to the FBI, and he has just returned from Mecca with a totally new geopolitical worldview.
Malcolm X.
That's him. And then, crashing the party late, you have a really tough, cynical British tabloid reporter from 2001. She writes for the Sunday Express, and she has just spent 10 days as a captive of the Taliban.
Yvonne Ridley. That is quite the guest list.
Yeah, right. On the surface, these three have absolutely nothing in common. I mean, you've got a mystic, a revolutionary, and a witness. They're from different races, entirely different eras. If you put them in a room, they'd probably argue until the sun came up.
They absolutely would.
But in this deep dive, we are going to explore the source material's argument that they are actually 3 chapters of the exact same book.
Yeah, they represent what the text calls the Western Muslim spectrum. Specifically, they show us 3 very distinct ways of shattering the Western silo.
The silo. That is really the villain of today's discussion.
Yeah.
We're digging into how the West built these very artificial walls between spirituality and politics, and how Guénon, Malcolm, and Ridley completely refused to live inside those walls.
And this isn't just some abstract history lesson either. The sources make a strong case that if you want to understand resistance today or say what is happening in Palestine right now, you have to understand the silo.
So welcome to the deep dive on Shattering the Silos. This is Resistance 101. Let's just jump right in.
Let's do it.
We have to start with the actual architecture of this thing, because when we say the silo, we obviously aren't talking about grain storage.
No, we're talking about a massive psychological split, something that happened in Europe roughly 400 years ago.
Right back in 1648.
Yes, 1648. The Peace of Westphalia. Now, you know, most people might remember this from history class as the treaty that ended the 30 Years' War in Europe.
Right.
But the source material argues it did something much deeper than just drawing new borders on a map.
It drew borders in the mind.
Exactly. Europe had just spent literally decades tearing itself apart over religion, millions of people dead. So the solution they came up with was this great divorce. They decided that from now on, politics, the state would handle power and public life.
And the church.
The church would handle the soul. Never the two shall meet.
Stay in your lane, basically.
Precisely. Faith became this sort of private hobby, like gardening or stamp collecting. It was no longer allowed to dictate how the world actually operated.
It created that classic Western binary right. Public versus private. Faith versus reason.
Church versus state. But here is the part that really trips people up, and the source material is super adamant about this. The very word religion, as a category separate from the rest of life, is a completely modern invention.
No, wait, that sounds a bit like a semantic trick. I mean, people have been praying and building temples for thousands of years. Are you saying they didn't have religion?
They didn't have a word that meant just the spiritual stuff you do on the weekend. Before the Enlightenment in Arabic or Hebrew or Sanskrit, that category just doesn't exist.
So what do they have instead?
Well, let's take the Arabic concept of deen, which is featured heavily in the text. We almost always translate it as religion, but that is actually a mistranslation.
Because deen isn't just a box you check on a census form.
Right. Deen implies a total way of life. It's framed as a life transaction or a debt you owe to the creator that encompasses literally everything. How you govern, how you trade, how you fight, and how you treat your neighbor. It's a total architecture of integration.
So the Western mindset is totally compartmentalized.
Yeah.
It says, I am a voter in the booth, I'm a consumer in the market, and I'm a believer in the pew.
While the Deen mindset says, I am one person. My spiritual belief is my political logic. And that is exactly why the West finds Islam so incredibly difficult to manage. It refuses to stay in the religion silo.
It won't be domesticated.
Exactly. And our 3 protagonists today, they are perfect case studies in what happens when you refuse that domestication.
Let's look at the first one, the guy who refused to play the game at all. Guénon.
The mystic exile.
He's such a fascinating figure because he's born into the absolute peak of Western confidence. It's 1886 in France, the Belle Epoque, Science is supposedly solving everything. They're expanding their colonies. They've got electricity, the cinema. Everyone is just cheering for progress.
And Guénon looks at all of it, the technology, the wealth, the colonial expansion, and he calls it the reign of quantity.
The reign of quantity.
Yeah.
But he wasn't just a Luddite, right? He wasn't just saying, oh, machines are bad.
No, it was much deeper. It was philosophical. He argued that the West had become entirely obsessed with things that could be measured and counted and weighed, but in doing so, it had completely lost the ability to perceive quality.
Like truth, beauty, the sacred.
Yes, if you can't put it in a spreadsheet, it doesn't exist. He believed that by amputating that spiritual dimension, by locking it in that Westphalian silo Western civilization was actually devolving.
The text mentions he saw it as a spiritual corpse dressed up in fancy clothes.
Exactly. So in 1930, he does something incredibly dramatic. He doesn't just write a bad review or a protest. He leaves.
He gets on a boat to Cairo.
And he never returns to Europe. And the specific detail from the text that always gets me is he didn't take a single European book with him.
Not one. He was just entirely done.
Done. He spent the rest of his life writing in Arabic. He practiced Sufism, specifically the Shafili Akbari order, and he just completely refused to re-enter the Western conversation.
You know, to a modern activist, that probably looks like quitting. Like he just checked out and went to meditate while the world burned.
It definitely looks like withdrawal, but the source argues this was actually interior resistance. Guénon realized you cannot fight a system that has amputated its soul by using its own soulless tools.
Right. If you argue with a materialist using materialist logic, you've already lost the argument.
You have to preserve the root. He founded what became known as the traditionalist school, influencing scholars like Syed Hossein Nasr and Martin Lings. His core argument was, before we can fix society, we have to remember what a human being actually is. If you lose connection to the transcendent nesame, the political fruit will always be poisonous.
So Guénon is the root. He goes inward to preserve the truth. But you can't stay inward forever. Eventually, the exterior world comes knocking. Which brings us to our second figure. Someone who definitely did not stay quiet in his room. Malcolm X.
The revolutionary saint. The branch to Guénon's root.
Now, you know everyone knows the basics of Malcolm X. But what's fascinating here is that he actually started out in a silo of his own making.
Right, with the Nation of Islam. Under Elijah Muhammad, it was a theology of survival and black self-determination, but it was hermetically sealed.
He was a racial silo. The theology was literally the white man is the devil. And it was a powerful counter-narrative for survival at the time, but it was cut off from the global reality of the faith.
And then comes 1964, the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca. Now, we usually hear this story framed as this sort of kumbaya moment, right? He sees blue-eyed Muslims, he realizes racism is wrong, and he sends a nice letter to his wife.
Right, that's the very sanitized version.
Right.
But the source material argues it was something much sharper than that. It wasn't just a spiritual awakening, it was a geopolitical one.
How so?
Well, the text points out he was hosted by Prince Faisal. And when Malcolm stood on the plain of Arafat, he wrote about being speechless and spellbound by praying shoulder to shoulder with men of all colors without any racial hierarchy. But he didn't just see brothers in faith. He saw a geopolitical bloc. Exactly, the Ummah. He realized that the Black American struggle wasn't just some isolated domestic civil rights issue. It was part of a massive global anti-colonial struggle. He connected it with African decolonization and with Palestine.
So he stopped asking for civil rights which are granted by the state and started demanding human rights which are granted by God and adjudicated internationally.
Yes. He completely merged the spiritual and the political. He shattered his silo. And that synthesis is what made him so incredibly dangerous to the status quo.
Right, because a strictly religious leader is fine, you give him a tax exemption and ignore him, and a strictly political leader is fine too, you can negotiate with him or arrest him.
But a man who prays 5 times a day, has absolute moral clarity, and is actively building political alliances between Harlem and international liberation movements, that breaks the silo.
He refused the binary. And the sources point out this synthesis is exactly why he was assassinated. He wasn't just one or the other, he was both, which made him a threat that the system simply couldn't allow.
He was the branch stretching out to connect these global struggles. So we have Guénon preserving the root and Malcolm building the branch. But to complete this spectrum, we need one more element. We need someone to bear witness.
Yvonne Ridley, the voice.
I love this pivot because she is such an unlikely candidate for this list. It's 2001. She is not a mystic. She is not a revolutionary. She's a cynical, tough-as-nails British tabloid reporter for the Sunday Express.
And she crosses into Afghanistan in a burqa to get the inside scoop on the Taliban.
Right. And it goes horribly wrong. She gets captured. She is held for 10 days by the most demonized regime on the planet.
She fully expects torture and death.
But instead, she gets a reading assignment.
Essentially, yeah. The Taliban commander releases her, but on one very specific condition. She has to promise to read the Quran.
And she takes the deal to get out. But she's completely cynical about it. She approaches it as opposition research. She wants to find the misogyny, the contradictions, so she can write a massive expose.
But this is where the source uses a great term, an epistemic event.
Meaning a fundamental shift in how you know what you know.
Exactly. Her conversion wasn't some emotional breakdown. It wasn't Stockholm Syndrome. It was purely intellectual. She read the text to fight it, and she lost the argument. She found an intellectual coherence, especially regarding women's rights and justice, that she felt was actually superior to the Western framework.
And that is a really hard pill for a lot of Western listeners to swallow. The idea that a Western journalist could look at the Quran and say, wait, this actually makes more sense for justice.
But that's the power of shattering the silo. She stopped looking at the faith through the managed lens of foreign culture and actually engaged with the text itself.
And unlike Guénon, who completely left the West, and Malcolm, who was martyred, Ridley stayed.
She stayed right in the belly of the beast.
Heck yeah.
In the Western media, and she paid a heavy price for it. She was barred from entering the USA despite being a British citizen, which she actually cited as proof of the exact double standards she was reporting on.
Right, she became the voice. Her method is resistance as presence, just using her professional credibility to challenge the narratives from inside the Western system.
So if we pull this all together, the source material provides this really interesting comparative map. We have the mystic preserving the truth at the root. We have the revolutionary building solidarity through the branch. And we have the witness providing the voice.
And the argument is that resistance isn't just one posture, it is a spectrum. The silo tries to separate these elements to neutralize them.
Exactly. The system wants the mystic to stay quietly in the monastery. It wants the revolutionary to be angry, but purely secular. And it wants the traumatized victim to just stay silent.
Because the West manages what counts as a serious argument. But when you combine them, when you have the spiritual depth of a Guénon, the political fire of a Malcolm, and the media presence of a Ridley, you get something unbreakable.
Which brings us to the real masterclass portion of this deep dive, because the sources apply this entire framework directly to the current situation in Palestine.
All right, this is the application. The text argues that the crisis in Palestine is where the Western silo system fails most lethally.
Because think about how the discourse is managed. We are constantly told to separate the issues. There's the security question over here, there's the humanitarian crisis over there, and there's the legal or theological debate somewhere else.
We talk about getting aid in like it's just a logistics problem, completely divorced from the political reality of dispossession.
That is the silo at work. It severs the symptom from the cause. The source argues that a resistance that only addresses one dimension will not hold. You need all three of our figures' lenses to actually diagnose what is happening.
So let's break that down based on the text. How would Guénon's view apply to the crisis?
Well, applying Guénon, the diagnosis is that the crisis stems from a complete loss of transcendent justice. It's what happens when you replace the sacred with the strategic. When land is just real estate and people are just demographics, violence is inevitable because the spiritual dimension has been amputated.
That's the root diagnosis, a loss of the soul. What about Malcolm's view applied here?
From Malcolm's framework, the crisis is the direct result of imperial and class interests. He would argue that all this humanitarian language is actually obscuring the reality of colonialism. He wouldn't see it as a complex tragedy. He'd see it as structural dispossession.
He'd demand international solidarity, not just charity.
Exactly. And finally, Ridley's view applied to this shows that the crisis is enabled by media failure and structural narrative control.
Right. The passive voice in headlines. The way the discourse demands perfect victims.
Yes. So the ultimate takeaway from the source is that all dimensions, the spiritual, the political, and the narrative, must be engaged simultaneously.
Shattering the silos.
Exactly.
It really is a lot to process. It forces you to rethink all these neat little categories we organize our lives into.
I just keep going back to that hypothetical dinner party.
Yeah, the quiet mathematician, the loud orator, and the cynical journalist.
They would have driven each other crazy. Guénon would have found Ridley too loud. Malcolm might have thought Guénon was way too withdrawn. But they shared this fundamental refusal to accept the colonizer's map of reality.
The map that says spirituality is over here and politics is over there. They forced their way out of those managed categories.
They really did.
So here is the thought I want to leave you with as you go about your day. This isn't just about history. The silo that needs to fall usually starts in our own heads. The system forces a choice between prayer and protest, between the interior and the exterior.
But to understand true resistance, you have to recognize that they are the exact same road.
Next time on the deep dive, we are zooming out. We've looked at the individuals who broke these silos. Next, we're going to look at the massive systems that build them.
Yes, we are moving into narrative control and the manufacturing of consent. How the stories you believe are constructed and sold to you.
It's going to be a big one. You won't want to miss it. Thanks for diving deep with us.
Catch you next time.